right, so we're going to talk about the federal budget today. Oh, I'm supposed to remind you that I'm Amy Weber, and I have had 19 years of experience with the federal government as both a Fed and a contractor, working in defense, HUD, state, justice, and commerce departments. Okay, we're going to talk about the federal budget. We are not going to fix the federal budget today. We're not going to fix the economy today. Sorry, guys. But hopefully there will be some information in here that you find valuable, that you can take into the voting booth, that you can take in as a constituent, that you can take in as a consumer of news about the federal government and about federal work and the budget process. So, whoops, well, see already, it wants to be mean to me. Come on now. Okay, there we go. Okay, today we're going to be talking about the federal budget process. So the process by which the federal budget gets made. We're also going to have to stop and talk about what the word budget means, because that word gets thrown around a lot in the federal government and it means a lot of different things. We're going to be talking about federal employee and contractor contributions to that budget. How do the employees actually influence the budget decisions? Why Congress continues to struggle with the federal budget process. And we're going to talk a little bit about continuing resolutions at the end. What we are not going to talk about is the federal deficit or debt, okay? I will let the much more intelligent economists that come and speak at HASP talk about that, okay? We'll mention them just a little at the end. And honestly, they're just the byproduct of whatever we pass in the budget. They're not an input into our budget. So we won't be talking about that today. Now, when I started to put this presentation together, I kept getting reminded again and again about the Hanukkah octopus. Do you guys know about the Hanukkah octopus? No? Okay. So a few years ago, my husband and I, it was the holiday season, we went to Starbucks, we were getting drinks, and we were getting food. My husband looks in a little case where all the different, things are where you can pick to eat. And he looked at the case and he said, turned to the barista and he said, "I will have the octopus." And I said, okay. So I strolled over and looked in the case. Sure enough, there's an octopus and it's wearing a yarmulke. And I said, oh, it's a Hanukkah octopus. Because it looked like this. It's a Hanukkah octopus. And of course, the barista thought we were insane because from her side of the glass, it's a reindeer. Right? Okay. But they look very different, right? As we're talking today about the federal budget, keep these octopi and reindeer in your mind, because when you're on one side of the glass, when you're doing the federal budget, it looks radically different than what you see on the other side. What you read about in the paper is radically different than what Congress and the federal employees are trying to do. So as we move through this process, just understand perspective really does matter. Also, my family insists it is an octopus, so we only ask for octopus cookies moving forward. All right. Congress has had the power of the purse in the United States since the founding of this country. However, the budget process that we know about today really started in 1974. At some point, y'all are going to have to tell me what was happening in the US in the early 1970s to make this crazy. As I did research for these two presentations, it seems like all the modern laws we go off came around in the Nixon administration. So I know it was tumultuous, but geez, all of them? All of them were being passed in the early 70s. The Congressional Budget and Impound Act was passed in 1974, and it was a reaction to things that Richard Nixon were doing. So since Thomas Jefferson, Congress has been passing budgets and presidents have been getting those budgets and saying, yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with this priority. I don't agree with whatever the objective is that you were trying to fund. I will direct my agency not to spend that money. So if you remember back to our first class, a giant section of the government is under the executive branch, right? Not the legislative branch. And Thomas Jefferson was actually influencing some of the judicial branch. He had a lot to say about the judicial branch as well. So even from all throughout the 1700s, the 1800s, the early 1900s, presidents were doing what was called impounding. Congress would pass a budget and the presidents would say, they would find some line item, not all of them, but some of them would find a line item they didn't want to fund. It didn't meet their priorities. They were trying to make a statement, a political statement. and they would impound the money, not let the agency spend the money. Apparently, Nixon was really bad at this. Congress got mad and they passed the Congressional Budget and Impound Act. And quite honestly, this has curtailed impounding from federal executives and from POTUS ever since. So this really did clip the wings. It did accomplish that. It clipped the wings of the president in being able to impound. This was something that you may, if you go back and read articles from the Trump administration, this was something that was constantly frustrating Trump, was that he couldn't, after the budget was passed, he couldn't move the money around the way he wanted to in certain discretionary funding. And it was specifically because of this act. This act also did 4 things. It established a fixed budget calendar. Now, it established the calendar, but there is no penalty if you don't meet the calendar. Keep that in mind. It established a budget committee in each house, in the House and in the Senate, that should say each chamber, in each chamber. Before this, there were various budget committees all over Congress, and there wasn't a unified one. Now, both the Senate and the House have a budget committee. That budget committee is in charge of the top line number. How much this year are we actually going to spend? Okay. It created the Congressional Budget Office. We're going to talk a lot about the CBO and what it does. And it outlined a budget reconciliation process. There really actually wasn't a way for the Senate and House. There wasn't a process established for the Senate and House to look at each other's markups and come to some sort of consensus. It was mainly backroom deals and handshakes up until this process was laid out in the Congressional Budget Act. Okay, so it was a very important act for us. 2 offices we'll be mentioning a lot: OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. These are the 2 agencies that work a lot with the formulation of the budget. What you should know of the difference between these one, as you can see, one is in the executive branch, one is in the legislative branch. The OMB is in the executive office of the president, okay? It's actually the largest group in the executive office of the president. You might remember from the first class, OMB is at the cabinet table. They actually sit on the cabinet, right? This is not nonpartisan, okay? This is a group that is influenced directly by who is president. Now, that's not to say that there aren't individuals with highly technical degrees in statistics and economics that are a part of the OMB. It's just to say that the OMB itself is about helping the president establish a budget that supports his, or eventually hers, priorities, okay? The CBO, on the other hand, the Congressional Budget Office, was created by law. It wasn't created because of the executives. It's created by law. It is a nonpartisan organization. Now, the person who runs it is a political appointee, and there always is a push and pull in Congress. So whoever usually has the majority in the House, it usually matches, that person usually comes from that kind of bent, whether it's conservative or liberal. However, the work that the CBO does is nonpartisan, and there isn't necessarily the push and pull of the priorities of Congress. The CBO doesn't just work with the budget. The CBO, you've heard this before, the CBO gives out scores for legislation. So every time Congress proposes a piece of legislation, the CBO is responsible for assigning it an economic score. It's called a score, but really, I don't know what they're scoring against. It's a bad word. What it means is it going to increase the deficit? How much will it cost us over 10-year increments? They're always looking at 10-year increments. Or will it save us money? How much will it reduce the deficit over a 10-year increment? So in essence, what is the economic impact of a law? The CBO is required to do this for all laws that have financial impact, whether or not Congress waits to hear the score before voting. That's political. And you'll hear certain Congress people say that. I don't want to vote until I see the score. So I see the CBO score. And then you'll hear one say, it doesn't matter what the score is, this is important legislation, I want to vote. They'll go back and forth, and that's what's happening. Okay, but the important thing to remember about that one is that it is nonpartisan. Okay, the federal budget process has 3 steps. Sorry, 5 steps. Sorry, 6 steps. Okay, it has as many steps as you want it to have. I like this, 6 steps, okay? It starts with federal agencies creating their budget requests. Now, the reason I like this 6 step, it's most often referred to as a 5-step process. I like this 6-step process because this first step is incredibly important, and it was the thing that I did in my life, was providing different agencies budget requests. They submit them to the OMB, the White House management, right, and budget. The OMB takes those requests and develops the budget proposal from the White House, okay? So all the agencies submit all the data to the White House. The White House zips that up into a budget proposal. And then that's given to Congress. Now, as we'll find out, we're going to watch a video here in a second. As we find out, whether or not Congress has anything to do with that budget is completely up to Congress. There's nothing in the Congressional Budget Act that says that you have to pay attention to what the president just told you or what the president has put in their budget. Now, you might want to, because they just asked the agencies a bunch of really interesting questions about their priorities and their spend and what they want to do. So they're getting data from a lot of different sources that are valuable in putting together a budget. It's not just coming out of thin air of what the president wants, but Congress is not legally obligated to pay attention to the president's budget. So I know there's a lot of talk usually around when the president releases their budget, talking about how much it's going to increase the debt or how unrealistic its budget assumptions are. The president's budget is meaningless. It's not whatever gets passed into law. And it's only as important to Congress as Congress lets it be. President submits that to Congress. Congress then has to decide on the budget limit, which we'll talk about in this video in a second. And then it's divided between subcommittees. The House and Senate have to do a lot of voting. And at the end of the day, they're supposed to vote on all the appropriations bill and we're supposed to have a budget. And that's how it's supposed to work. Now let's talk about what's really happening. So, okay, let's all say a prayer that this works, how it is supposed to. Okay.
The federal budget process is the way the federal government decides how to spend money. There are 5 main steps. 1. The president sends a budget request to Congress. 2. Congress writes and votes on budget resolutions. 3. House and Senate appropriations subcommittees mark up bills. 4. The House and Senate vote on appropriations bills and turn them into one big bill. And 5. The president signs all of the different appropriations bills and the budget becomes law. Why are there so many steps in the budget process? In 1974, Congress was worried that the president had too much power. Congress did not like how the president spent tax money. Congress passed a law to give Congress more control over the budget than the president. Let's go over each step of the budget process in more detail. 1. The president's budget request is what the president wants the budget to be. A budget request shows what the president thinks is important to spend money on. The president starts by listening to budget requests from different departments in the government, like the Department of Education or the Department of Labor. Each department tells the president how much money they need. The president listens to all of the departments. Then the president decides how much money to ask Congress for in the budget request. The president's budget request needs to say how much money the president wants to spend, how much money the government wants to get from taxes, if the government is going to spend more or less money than it gets from taxes. After the president has listened to all the departments and answered these important questions in the budget request, they send the budget request to Congress for review. 2. Congress writes and votes on a budget resolution. Congress is made of 2 parts, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Sometimes we will call the House of Representatives just the House. After Congress gets the president's budget request, the House and the Senate write and vote on their own separate budget resolutions. A budget resolution is the House and Senate's own plan for how the government will spend money. Sometimes the president and Congress disagree on what is important. That means that the budget resolutions from Congress can end up looking very different from the president's budget request. While the president's budget is an important starting point, it is up to the House and Senate to make final decisions about what important things will be included in the federal budget. If the House and the Senate disagree on what is important, they will write different budget resolutions. If the House and the Senate write different budget resolutions, they have 3 choices. The Senate can get rid of their own bill and pass the House's version. The House can get rid of their own bill and pass the Senate's version. Or they can compromise. When the House and the Senate compromise on a bill, it is called going to conference. The people who meet are called the conference committee. The conference committee looks at the two different budget resolutions from the House and the Senate. Then, the conference committee turns them both into one final budget resolution for the House and Senate to vote on. If the Senate and House both vote for the budget resolution, then that budget resolution passes. But the budget resolution is just a plan. Passing the budget resolution doesn't mean anything happens. It's up to the appropriations bills to explain how to actually spend money in the budget. 3. The House and the Senate write appropriations bills. The House and the Senate both have a lot of small groups called committees. Committees pay special attention to different topics, like education or the Army. The committee that pays attention to how to spend the money in the budget is called the Appropriations Committee. The House and the Senate both have their own appropriations committees. The Appropriations Committee is made of even smaller groups called subcommittees. Right now, there are 12 subcommittees. Subcommittees focus on different things that the federal government does. Each subcommittee has a meeting where they talk to different people in charge of different parts of the federal government. Then each subcommittee writes a bill to tell the Appropriations Committee what they decided. The Appropriations Committee marks up the bills based on what the subcommittees decide. Markup means that the committee can make changes to the bills. If someone on the committee wants to make a change, the change is called an amendment. Once the Appropriations Committee is done making changes, they vote on the bill. If the bill gets enough votes, the appropriations bill goes on to the next step. The Appropriations Committee must do this whole process 12 times, once for each of the 12 different subcommittees. The House and the Senate both have their own separate appropriations committees. They both use the same process for writing appropriations bills, but they might not do it at the same time. Usually, the House goes first. 4. The Senate and House vote on all of the different appropriations bills. Once the House Appropriations Bills Committee has voted for a bill, the whole House gets a chance to vote on the bill. If the bill gets enough votes in the House, then it goes to the Senate. Sometimes the Senate writes their own bills while the House is still writing the House bill. Usually, the Senate waits for the House to finish their appropriations bills first. When the House appropriations bills are ready, the appropriations subcommittees in the Senate look at the House appropriations bills. The Senate appropriations subcommittees decide if they want to make any changes. Then, they give the new version of the bills to the Senate Appropriations Committee. The bills get marked up again, which means that the Senate Appropriations Committee can make more changes. The Senate Appropriations Committee votes on the bills, and finally, the whole Senate gets a chance to vote for the bills. In order for a bill to pass, the Senate and the House both have to vote on the same version. If one side makes changes to the bill, the other side has to vote for the bill again. It can take a very long time to have both the House and Senate agree on all the bills. It is normal if this sounds confusing and complicated. It is confusing and complicated even for people who have been in Congress for a long time.
I'm going to stop it right there. I should have warned you that was a little bit long. So just a couple of things to emphasize there. So what's happening, the budget proposal that it comes from the White House is just a proposal. The first thing Congress has to do is a budget resolution, but all that is doing is telling you how much money Congress is willing to spend in that fiscal year. I think it's rather odd that then they break that down into appropriations. Why wouldn't you start with the appropriations and find out what each section of the government wants and then come up with a total and then negotiate the total? I don't know. Not there. Couldn't figure that out. So, but they come up with the resolution first. Then it's broken into those 12 committees. Now, I know that graphic was a little misleading. That's 12 committees in the House and 12 committees in the Senate, okay, that have to go through this very long process. If anybody changes anything at any time, they all have to go back through. The appropriation, the committees vote independent before the whole Senate or House vote. And then there has to be one bill that is then sent to the president for signature, okay? So that's the process as we know it. Okay, and so that act that we talked about from 1974, this is the calendar that they set for that process. So that process was set out in the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. But this is the timeline that was originally set out. The president is supposed to be submitting his or her budget proposal on the first weekend in February. There's supposed to be hearings because these budget committees can bring in, they often bring in the department heads, they'll bring in agency heads to talk to them about why did your agency request this? Why are you saying this? Where is this program? What happened to this missile? What happened to the schooling here? What's going on over in Nevada? They'll ask them these different questions. So these budget related hearings are supposed to happen into the start of spring. The budget resolution, that's the top line number, is supposed to be coming out somewhere around tax time. So around now would be coming out. The appropriations actions are supposed to be happening and everything is supposed to be ready by October 1st because the fiscal year from the government runs October 1st to September 30th. So this is the way the process is designed. Have we done that since 1974? No. We've done that 4 times since 1974. So since 1974, this is the percent of standalone appropriations bills. So those are those 12 bills, right? So how many times have we passed all 12? 4 times since 1977. That's actually when the full effect of the Budget Reconciliation Act came in. So we've passed it 4 times. Now there have been years where we've gotten over 50. Well, 1 year. 1 year we got over 50. There's years where we've gotten some appropriations of those 12 through. But the most, look at all the ones where there's nothing. That means in those years, no appropriations bills came out in those years, or at least they didn't come out by October 1st. So we had to fund the government through a different mechanism. Some would argue, some have argued, those who study the federal government, that if you design a process, and now this is 50 years old, it's 1974, it's 50 years old. If you design a process 50 years ago and it has a timeline and you've only been able to meet the timeline 4 times, maybe you need to think about adjusting the timeline or changing the process. So that's something that comes up a lot in the literature. Now, those 12 committees, they are not broken down. If you remember right, there's 15 cabinet agencies or cabinet departments, and then there's all those independent agencies. So they're not broken down by those. You'll see here that we have a lot of different things. Commerce, Justice, and Science are on one committee, but then Defense has a committee all unto themselves, right? So they've lumped these things together. There's probably some logic that went into why they lumped them together. It is not economic. These are not equal in what amount of money these groups are working with. They're not even really equal in scope, but they're kind of close throughout it. But these are the 12 committees that both the Senate and House would have. You can see here, this is just, I just found a random one from FY 2016 and FY 2017. You can see here that like the Defense Subcommittee is working back in 2016. They were working with $514 billion. So that committee was talking about how do we allocate, how do we appropriate, how do we spend $514 billion. Well, the Legislative Branch Committee was only talking about $4.4 billion. So these committees are not equal in size. These committees are not equal in the scope that they're working with. But this is the process that the Congress has picked. Now let's talk for a second. Like I said, I like the 6-step process that starts with how do federal employees get information over to the OMB. Now, there's lots of ways to represent this, but I really like this one. I don't know why. This was one I found that the DOD had put together. I guess I really like that the airman is he's concerned that his airplane doesn't have something and he's requesting something. There's actually 2 ways in my experience. So a lot of what I'm about to say is going to be based on my experience, both as a federal employee, as a federal contractor. In my experience, there's 2 ways that budget requests come. First of all, they start in the summertime. Budget requests start in the summertime, the end of summer, leading into the end of the fiscal year. We'll start getting what are called data calls. These are calls from OMB or from, usually it's higher up in the agency, is calling, asking for information. How much money did you actually spend on this project? How much money is being allocated for this? What's your wish list look like? Like if you could do anything, what would it be and how much would it cost, right? Can you go get quotes for a specific piece of software? Can you go get quotes for how much labor would be involved in a project that we're interested in doing. So these data calls come out. In my experience, there's two ways. We'll either be told, hey, the president wants a 10% cut across the board. So when you're putting together your budget request, 10% down from last year. We'll be told that there's a number we're trying to get to, or a percent we're trying to get to. So whatever we're put in, we should take that into account. That's one way. The other way is some years you're told, okay, tell me everything. And then this is a cyclical process. Then we're going to come back and say, all right, slash it by 30%. All right, but take out anything that doesn't have to do with cybersecurity. Okay, but absolutely no growth in contracts over 4 years. So this is a process that is a conversation between the agencies and the submissions and the OMB that is ongoing. And a lot of data is collected during this. A lot of time is spent by federal employees and contractors putting this data together to go over to the OMB. Once that data is put together, there are individuals in each agency that is responsible for putting the actual requests together, the budget requests together. Those budget requests are then submitted to the OMB themselves. And again, those budget requests are based on the information they've gotten further down. So everybody's involved in the chain. And contractors are intimately involved in this because remember from our first class, contractors are doing a lot of the legwork. They're the ones getting quotes from vendors. They're the ones getting quotes from subcontractors and suppliers. So they are intimate of all the financial knowledge that's out there. So they're critical to helping put together the budget request that comes. It goes up the agency, whatever the approval is, and eventually makes its way to POTUS. Okay, so the defense kind of outlined it as a nice little gamification of this graphic, but that's in essence what's happening. Now, if you ask me as a person who's worked for the federal government and as a federal contractor, if there's one problem I have with how the federal budget process is put together, it would be use it or lose it. The federal government works under a use it or lose it policy for most things, okay? This means that if in 1 year I have requested, I'm just gonna throw out just magic numbers that are round, okay? If I ask for $1 million for a project, and then I end up only spending $90,000 or $900,000 on that project, I am going to be taken to task of why I didn't spend that $100,000. I'm going to have to answer a lot, and I'm going to have to fill out a bunch of paperwork. Now, there might be a legitimate reason. One of the biggest reasons we run into this is labor costs. Labor costs go down because people are out sick, somebody had a baby, somebody retired early, right? And your labor costs are not the right estimate of what you had in work. This happens all the time. And you're off. You're off by some number. You have to explain that. And then when you go to submit your request for that specific line item in the budget and you request another $1 million for the next fiscal year, you're going to be asked, you didn't spend the $100,000. Why would I give you $1 million? I'm going to give you $950,000. Or I'm not going to give it to you if this happens multiple years. I'm just going to assume you guys are overinflating your budgets. There's an assumption baked into the process that the agencies are trying to get one over on the larger government, that they're trying to inflate their numbers. I personally think that's hooey. Every time I submitted a number, I had to have all the receipts. I had to have all of the quotes from all of the suppliers and vendors. I had to prove by hour every employee and their hourly bill rate, which is hard to figure out with federal employees. I had to have them in there and how many hours and where my hour estimates were. If there are people in the government pulling these numbers out of thin air, God bless them. I never worked with them, okay? The same is true for contractors. So contractors also have a use it or lose it. So if you, and they have an even more incentive to try to spend the money. So if I have given you a contract with the federal government and I said over the next 4 years, you can bill $4 million. You are tracking from day one what your burn rate on that $4 million is. And it's somebody's responsibility in your organization to make sure that on the last day of that contract, you have billed all $4 million to the federal government. So if something happens in the middle of your contract, if you have a labor shortage, or if all of a sudden price of goods go down, or you had a delay in somebody's security clearance, so for 3 months you weren't billing a labor category, you are going to work with your contracting officer and your contracting officer representative to make sure that you get that money somehow. Maybe you'll add some scope into that contract, or you'll add a different labor category, or you'll go out and buy something. Now, the contractor, of course, wants that because that's their $4 million contract. Why does the government want contractors to do that? Because they don't want to fill out the paperwork of use it or lose it. So this to me is the biggest problem I see with the budget is you are getting penalized for when you don't meet your budget from the year before. So when you're putting together your budget estimates going forward, you have to take that into account. Now, I should say, if you do something like you find an error in a computer system that's been costing taxpayer dollars, it's rounding up instead of down like it's supposed to be, or if you find like some actual malfeasance happening in the government and it ends up saving it, you will get rewarded for that. Okay, there actually are times where federal employees stumble across something that's happening especially if it saves the taxpayers money or it makes the agency look good, you will get rewarded for that. But that's not part of your general budget process. Now, this isn't just me. There have been studies conducted. Federal agencies spend on average 4.9 times more in the last week of their fiscal year than in the typical week. So in the law enforcement world, September is known as federal Christmas. Okay. So all the managers come in and say, oh, okay, federal law enforcement often has their own vehicles. They have federal vehicles, they have fleet vehicles, and they have certain things in the budget around oil changes and around car maintenance and tires, et cetera. They'll come in and say, oh, guys, we didn't spend our money. Everybody go get your oil change this week, right? Everybody go get your car washed. Everybody go get this. They'll come in with catalogs, throw them down. Okay, we have $10,000 to spend. Start picking out flashlights, start picking out equipment, right? For me in IT, this was the week that I was allowed to buy office supplies. Otherwise, I didn't have office supplies. Because nobody wants to put office supplies in their budget because that's the first thing that's going to get X'd out. Nobody wants to hear that taxpayers' dollars are going for pens, right? BIC isn't supposed to get rich off the federal government. So on the last week, we were told, okay, we got a surplus of $9,000. Who needs Post-it notes? This happened all the time. So on average, 8.7% of the agency spending occurs in the last week of the budget year. 8.7%. That's huge. That's on average. Some agencies are more, some agencies are less. Interestingly enough, the Department of Justice actually is the only agency that has special authority to roll over. And they have this special authority for this 4% of IT spend. And when researchers went in and studied them, they actually found that this had meaning, right? They actually spending that week is only 3.4% instead of that 4.9, right? So they actually found that when you give them rollover, people don't consider it federal Christmas, right, in September. I'll give you another example. When I was actually at the Justice Department, I had a supervisor who very smartly figured out that nobody was printing anymore in the printers. We were all taking our computers to meetings. We had no reason to print. The lawyers did. The lawyers were off printing. But the rest of the group wasn't printing much. But we had really expensive contracts for copiers, for multifunction copy machines. And those contracts had labor and supplies that were associated with them. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that was just one small little unit inside of the antitrust division of the Department of Justice. So we did the analysis, took us months, did the analysis, what impact would it have to get rid of the copiers, had to do some surveys on that. How much money could we actually save the taxpayers by not having that? How could we save the agency? What did that look like? And it was determined, yay, let's get rid of these contracts and we won't have these supplies, and it'll free up space, it'll free up supplies, and it'll save the taxpayers money. Excellent. You're not doing that this fiscal year. You're putting that in your budget for next fiscal year. So even though we did the analysis in February, we're going to have to wait to try to implement that in the next fiscal year. Because if you cut the contracts off in mid-year, you're going to end up paying for it down. So again, I have a real problem with use it or lose it out there. Oh, this is an example. It's not a great example because I had to sanitize the slide so much. But this is an example of the types of slides that contractors use to report the health of contracts they have. And the big thing on this one is to take a look at this section here with this graph. what I was trying to say is something I mentioned before, that from the start of a contract till the end of a contract, contractors are monitoring that burn rate, right? And so you can see on this specific one, this is actually one I did for a contract. I've sanitized the heck out of this, so believe me, it would have been a much more impressive slide if I hadn't done it. You can see that the problem here in the notes, we have a variance in plan due to extended illness of one of the subs. So one of our subcontractors had an extended illness, so I couldn't bill for their bill rate. And so I was monitoring that, and I would get that back in the end, right? Eventually down the road. It was a 3-year contract, so I assumed I would get it back in the end. Okay, so this wonky process, this comes from the White House, goes to the House and Senate, figures out the budget resolution, then goes into the 12 different committees, and then it has to come back and be voted on as the regular Congress, and then or as the full Congress, and then actually given over to the president for signature. So what is the actual breakdown of the money that they're talking about when they're trying to do all of these appropriations? We're actually going to watch a video on that. This one's much shorter, I promise. Much shorter video. But it explains something that's important about what's wrong with why Congress struggles with this.
Federal government spends a lot of money, about $6 trillion in 2022. That's about 25% of the gross domestic product, or GDP, a measure of the size of the economy, meaning that federal government spending accounted for about 1 out of every $4 in the economy. So where does all that money go? Federal spending can be divided into 3 slices. Mandatory spending is the biggest slice. It includes Social Security, Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid, health insurance for the poor, and other benefits. In 2022, mandatory spending comprised nearly 2/3 of the budget. When it comes to these programs, Congress sets the rules: how Social Security benefits are calculated, who is eligible for Medicare, how much doctors and hospitals are paid for services, and then the government pays the bills. This spending is called mandatory because the government must pay for the benefits for anyone who qualifies. No further approval of Congress is needed. They are sometimes known as entitlements because those eligible for benefits are entitled to them. The second slice is discretionary spending. In this slice, Congress decides annually how much to spend and on what. Things like salaries for government employees, electricity for the national parks, foreign aid, missiles and tanks for the military. Discretionary spending was roughly 25% of federal spending in 2022. You sometimes hear complaints about how much taxpayer money goes to foreign aid. Even with the large increase in foreign aid to Ukraine in recent years, total foreign aid accounts for less than 2% of all federal spending. And what about all those bureaucrats? Salaries and benefits for all federal employees, including the military, accounted for only about 10% of all federal spending in 2022. The third slice is interest payments on the federal debt, about 8% of all spending in 2022. So where does the government get all this money? From taxes and from borrowing. In 2022, about 75% of spending was financed by taxes and 25% was financed from borrowing. The government collected about $4.9 trillion in taxes in 2022, 54% from individual income taxes, 30% from Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes, and the remaining 16% from corporate and other taxes. Let's put this all in perspective. Federal spending has been reasonably stable at about 21% of GDP for decades. Rising recessions like the Great Recession of 2007-2008, when, for instance, more people claimed unemployment benefits, or during the COVID pandemic, when the government spent heavily to help households and businesses. Federal revenues have been relatively stable at about 17% of GDP, falling in recessions as fewer people are working, so there's less tax revenue. In most years, the government spends more than it takes in, and when the government spends more than it collects in taxes, the difference is known as the deficit. The deficit in 2022 was 5.5% of GDP, a little larger than the average over the past 30 years.
All right, so the big thing there is that whole wonky process with the OMB and Congress and everything else, it only applies to discretionary spending. It only applies to that 25% of that pie. Okay, that's, I think, a very important thing that people forget. That the majority of our budget now in the federal government is done automatically, right? Another interesting thing about this, Did anybody get surprised when she said federal spending and federal taxation has been pretty steady? She mentioned the word steady. That's not what we usually hear. We usually hear it's ballooning, it's skyrocketing. The national debt is, but ballooning and skyrocketing. But really, when you look at us over time, and more importantly, when you look at our budget, how much we spend versus our GDP, which is how we measure ourselves not only internally, but against the rest of the world. If you go out and look at how is federal spending in France versus its GDP, you can get a better number of how to compare that to the US. So the UN uses the GDP figure. When you do that, we're actually not spending federal dollars at the way that other countries are doing. And our debt becomes a whole different thing, a whole different way of looking at it. I find it very interesting to look at this longitudinally versus looking at just what each Congress tells us is happening in the budget for them. So, like I said, whoops, no, okay. There we go. Okay, so that discretionary part of the pie is all of that this federal budget process is about. Well, look at this. In 1968, that piece of the pie that Congress had to figure out the budget for was 66%. Today, it's 25%. But the country has gotten bigger. There's more of us here. There's more Americans that need federal services, more Americans going to national parks, more Americans eating from that food supply that the USDA is supposed to help us monitor, right? The EPA, more sites for the EPA to look at. But those parts are a smaller piece of the pie when it comes to Congress. So we have just as big a Congress. There was 100 senators back in 1968 as there's 100 senators in 2028, which is when this projection is out to, right? We're actually at 25% now, so I don't even know how smaller that piece is going to be actually in 2028. For that, Congress is roughly the same size. The country's bigger, but this piece of pie is dramatically smaller that they're budgeting for. So we have a Congress that is fighting over scarce resources. That's what this really is. Congress fights over scarce resources. And Congress isn't just polarized from politics. They're all individuals with different political aspirations, but also political needs. Their constituents have different political needs. The state of Washington is not the same as the state of Florida. It's not the same as the state of Missouri. And so what their priorities are and what that works for the agencies, that's important for each of those. Well, it's supposed to be important for each of the Congress people that represent those areas. So they're fighting. So what do they do when they can't do this budget in a timely manner and they can't do it efficiently? They have to go to continuing resolutions. Now, Congress has enacted at least one continuing resolution in all but 3 of the past 47 fiscal years. Okay, this is not a new concept for us. But from 2010 to 2022, policymakers passed 47 of them, including one that lasted up to 176 days. That would be more shocking for us if Congress just hadn't passed the budget for FY24 just 2 weeks ago, right? So we must have been on day 100 and something when that happened. I forgot to do the math before the class for that one. In the 21st century, Congress has used CRs to provide funding for federal agencies on average 5 months each fiscal year. So on average, they're screwing up that timeline by 5 months, okay? Remember, right now, we're halfway through fiscal year 24, as far as the federal government is concerned. We're halfway through the governmental fiscal year, and they just passed the budget. Just did the appropriations 2 weeks ago. Okay, so here's the number of CRs that have been enacted from 77 to 2024. You can see we did have a big spike happening in the early 2000s, but for the most part, we see just up and down, up and down. So kind of a roller coaster that is doing this. So what do continuing resolutions, besides delaying the budget process, besides making this whole thing extend out, what do continuing resolutions actually do? They disrupt the financial planning of agencies. And again, remember, federal employees and federal contractors are being asked constantly for inputs to help them understand the future planning of priorities of new projects, as well as the spend on current projects and labor. So if you're disrupting that financial planning, that's a huge result. The biggest thing from my point of view, when I worked with the federal government, was hiring. We were always under a hiring freeze. It wasn't an official freeze, which does periodically happen. Every once in a while, an agency or Congress will freeze the actual hiring in order to adjust numbers in the budget. These weren't official freezes. These were freezes because there wasn't a budget passed. So we didn't know how many people we could hire. We didn't know how many background checks we could afford. So these hiring a staff was always a problem. When I was a contractor, one of the things you do is you hire the proper candidate, but they're pending the background check of the agency they need to go work for. Because remember, I was working embedded with government, and sometimes you're not embedded, it's a different process for security clearances. But I was working in the facilities with government workers. I one time had an employee that waited 9 months to get a background check for that. I obviously couldn't keep that employee, right? Because they had gone off and got another job in that 9-month time. Beginning of new projects and activities. There is a way, the government does have a way to prioritize security-related activities and projects, particularly around security systems, the national security stuff, as well as IT, cybersecurity. So there is a way to begin new projects or activities that relate to security. But if you're not related to security, if it's an improvement of a system, or if it's an upgrade, or if it's a redesign, this beginning of new projects and activities always gets delayed. One of the biggest projects that the government is currently trying to upgrade is a centralized system for the Department of Defense, IT system around the Department of Defense. You may have read about it because the price tag associated with it is over $1 trillion. Now, remember last week I talked a little bit about contractors, how sometimes the work is so specialized that they'll release a vehicle so all the companies bid to get on the vehicle. And when you're on the contract vehicle, then you're the only companies allowed to bid on the work. So they've been doing this now for 5 years. They bid the vehicle, Apple got on it, Microsoft got on it, Amazon got on it. Like there's only 4 or 5 people that actually, HP, I think, qualified for it to do it. When they finally made the award, what happens? We're in a continuing resolution that buys some time for everybody to dispute what's happening. Anytime a contract is huge, large like this, if it's 100 million or more, actually, if it's probably 10 million or more, to be quite honest, whoever's the loser has the right to appeal and get the records of how you figured out that this person, that the winner actually won the award. That process started because a continuing resolution was ongoing. That process started. As of today, $0 have been spent on this project. The Department of Defense finally had to say the juice wasn't worth the squeeze to have the lawyers get involved with how much money was. So they actually took the contract and split it up between the 4 major IT vendors in the US. And still, not a penny's been spent on it because these continuing resolutions make it that the money gets locked and then a new project can't start. And that's just enough time for everybody to get their hackles up and start other processes that would have been done. There are programs that do get limited or halted altogether under a continuing resolution. Very important for grants. So grants are usually only funded till the end of a fiscal year. So when the money runs out at the end of the fiscal year, there is no more grant money. This really impacts HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, because they have grants for Section 8 housing that go into that. It affects the SNAP program, a lot out of the Health and Human Services and the Food and Drug Administration. So a lot of those get impacted as well. So grants, they can sometimes pull together the money from other places in the agency, but often, or rely on the states if the money's already been allocated to the states if it's that type of grant. Otherwise, it can be really debilitating when these things go on for 176 days. Rate of spending, this is something we don't often think about, but when you pass a continuing resolution, when you're in a continuing resolution, you're frozen in the budget from the fiscal year prior. So all the agencies this year, all of the agencies have been spending their this is FY24 right now. They have been spending at their FY23 levels. Since last October to now, they've just been spending at those levels. They didn't fire any staff. They didn't probably really hire any staff. They didn't go out and purchase anything because they don't know what their budget's going to be. They've been staying steady at that level. Well, if Congress comes back and says, all right, I'm giving you an extra 10%, great. But now I have 6 months to spend it or use it or lose it. And if you come back now and tell me I get 10% less in my budget, now I only have 6 months to figure out where to save it. So it really messes with the spending for the full year spending. And it really messes with how the contractors and feds have to report what they are. Because telling Congress, telling the White House that the reason you didn't spend all the money was because of the continuing resolution doesn't fly. It doesn't fly. And then, of course, it leaves the federal agencies stuck on the funding levels and policy directives of the prior year. You can't change policy direction, right? If that brand new policy, the student loan, if it has to do with student loans and it's a brand new policy from the current president and it's something that hasn't been in the budget before, unless it's passed, you don't know that you're going to be able to move in that direction or not. So it leaves not only the agency in limbo, it leaves all the people that those new policies would affect in limbo as well. Doesn't prevent politicians from going around and talking about their budgets, but it doesn't do that. Now, one thing I wanted to note, okay, so this federal budget process again. So if we're looking at this year, right, we just passed it. So theoretically, and so two weeks ago, Congress passed the budget for FY24. About a week prior to that, Biden released his budget. Okay, so he's a little late on the February date. Congress is really late on passing the FY24 budget. Theoretically, everybody should have done their budget-related hearings and should be starting their appropriations actions. I will take bets on if that's happening. It's not happening. Okay, some committees are meeting. You can go to the house.gov website and find out about congress.gov and find out about that. Some are, but not the appropriations committee. Okay, and they are historically bad at meeting on time during election years because they're historically bad at being in Washington, D.C. during election years. They're all on the campaign trail. One thing I'd like to note is that you often hear in the media, you'll hear about other budgets, right? The House Freedom Caucus has a budget. The Senate blah, blah, blah has a budget. The House Progressives have a budget. These are all meaningless documents. They have nothing to do with the actual budget process. Nobody has asked them to go gather this information. Where they're getting the information from may be legitimate sources of information from other places, but they can't put out data calls to the federal employees and contractors the way that the White House can. Okay, so wherever they're getting their information from, it's not from a data call. They're really just doing it to show you what their priorities would look like if they put it in budget, and how that differs from what what the White House has proposed, what Congress is. So those budgets, don't get worried about them. They're meaningless as far as the actual action that's happening around them. So lastly, I just want to mention that, so because the FY24 budget was just passed, it's important to keep in mind what expires at the end of this fiscal year. And this happens every single fiscal year. But it's important because as we get into that October timeframe, when the election's heating up and all we're thinking about is the presidential election, hey, keep an eye on Congress and what they're doing and these agencies that go into continual resolution. If they don't do some action, things are going to start expiring, right? By the way, this year was really odd in the sense that they split up the continuing resolutions into two continuing resolutions. They're usually almost done as a continuing resolution to the budget. This year, they split them up in those two groups, and I've highlighted what those two groups were, right? So 6 committees were in the first group and 6 committees were in the second group. Again, doesn't make a ton of sense. It looks like they were trying to do the security related ones all together and the not security related ones, but somehow they stuck education and the legislative branch down with the security related ones. So anyway, that's what the yellow is trying to tell you. So the two continuing resolutions that they won. So the Farm Bill expires at the end of it expired at the end of FY23. That included SNAP and also the crop insurance. Hugely important for the farmers is the federal crop insurance program that expired in FY23. The continuing resolution did continue that forward, but now it expires at the end of this fiscal. So they're not addressing crop insurance. So we don't know what's going to be happening with that. Again, hugely important for the farmers of America. And there's a lot of comments and a lot of policy changes about that particular policy and what it should cover and what it shouldn't cover. Some hard conversations that need to happen with that. The National Flood Insurance Program authorization, that is also expiring at the end of this fiscal year. Hugely important for the states that are being affected by climate change, in particular, all of the Gulf states, as well as most of the states up the eastern seaboard. Doesn't affect quite as many on the western seaboard, but the does on the eastern seaboard. That's expiring at the end of this year too. And then the authorization related to security, the TANF program, that also expires at the end of this one too. So that's where we stand. It's a great and rosy process. It happens every year, just like it's designed to do. And with that, I think I will take questions. I'm going to go back to the slide so you're not stuck on that other one. I hate that.
This is really a comment, not a question, but that I love that use it or lose it, and September being like Christmas. That goes all the way down. I worked for local Head Start for a few years, and if we didn't spill enough paint or break enough crayons or something, by September we had money left. And so the catalogs came out and we could, it was Christmas. We could get a lot of new toys or equipment and things like that. And ideally, it would have been better if that money could have rolled over to the next year, because you don't know what's going to happen in the next year. But that's how it works.
Well, and that's a great example too of, there's a lot of education grants being given by the federal government. Wouldn't it be great if the grant programs could roll over, right? Because you never know. And you can do some prediction in the grant programs. When cohort years are going to be larger than other cohort years. When the economy is hitting certain communities. When there's been natural disasters that FEMA has to account for. It'd be great if those grants could roll over, but they can't roll over either, which means then the states can't roll over them, the locals can't roll over them, and just right down. Yeah, it's a great point. Oh, I think we got Denny. Yep.
If we forgive all this student debt, where does that fit into the budget, into, GNP? That just totally loses me. I can't figure that one out.
Yeah, neither can I. So I'll be honest, I had wanted to end this presentation by talking about budget gimmicks. The things that all the parties do, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Congress, the White House, independent organizations, all the things that they do to make it seem like their budget saves money or doesn't save money, right, et cetera. And student loan was a big part of the conversation that's currently happening around budget gimmicks. I got lost. I don't know. So I will pass that on to the economists, the two classes, that we really do need to talk about these budget gimmicks. Because it was surprising to me. There's a lot of different organizations that have nonpartisan think tanks and nonpartisan groups that talk about the federal budget. You can Google them and get to what they're talking about with these budget gimmicks. If you just Google budget gimmicks or federal budget gimmicks, there's a lot of these sites that will come up. These are hugely important because every single one I had heard a politician say or a newspaper talk about, or I could find a soundbite. I could just turn on CNN or MSNBC or Fox and hear somebody actually say it while I was trying to research it. But it was just a little too complicated for me. And that's where I'm going to just put student loans in there too. I apologize. I don't really have a good answer for that one. That's okay. Okay.
Yep, we have a
Marianne,
question.
you have a question?
Yep,
And
we have a
then you have one
question
up here.
online.
Mhm.
What is the incidence of sunsetting when new priorities arise? And how much does big money influence affect budget decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing we didn't talk about here is sequester. So Congress, as I said, right, only 4 years out of the 50 has Congress actually done all of their appropriations on time. So last year, in 23, Congress decided to try to hold itself accountable. I don't know how they got the votes to pass this thing, but whatever. They decided to hold themselves accountable, and they passed a law that said that if they don't have all of their, if they don't have the appropriations completed by the end of April, that the government would go into sequester, meaning that there would be automatic cuts across all discretionary spending. Nobody wants that because those are indiscriminate. Every agency would be mad. All the constituents would be mad. Grantees would be, it would be a huge problem. So nobody wants that. Sure enough, that might have been why they were able to get it through this year. They saw the red lights flashing that this was coming. It might have actually helped us this year. It was really there to stave off full year continuing resolutions. When that process was ongoing, when they were deciding on that law, they talked a lot about the sunsetting of programs. So this is where an individual program, it's decided is no longer valuable. I believe that's what the individual is talking about with the sunsetting of programs. That's how I know the term to reflect. So when I was involved with technology that was sunsetting, sometimes technology is a little bit easier than some other parts of the government. We know when technologies are obsolete. And you have to prove, a lot of time it's that they're no longer under warranty or they're not going to get updated by the software providers anymore. So you had to, if you wanted an exemption to it automatically sunsetting, you had to file an exemption for that. For instance, Word 123, which is a word processing program from God knows where, from when computers took up whole rooms, right? Rob, you remember that one? That still exists in the Justice Department because there are some courts out in the 9th District, way out there in the West, who for some godforsaken reason can only process certain appeals in Word 123. Okay, so we had to write exemptions every year of why we're not sunsetting that particular program. So there are automatic sunsets, and then there are sunsets based on actual policies that go with that. What I would say about how industry influences that is that I've never once seen a product or a technology being, or a program for that matter, being sunsetted that somebody isn't talking about what will we replace it with. So it's not about, do we still have this need? It's about, what do we replace it with? And I have a technology, or I have a vendor, or I have a program that can help us take this to the next level, take it into the 21st century, use whatever euphemism you like, right? But the actual need analysis that goes into that, do we actually need this program? Do we actually need to move it forward in the same way? That in my experience is not necessarily a conversation that happens at the agency level. That might be happening higher up in that SES level, might be happening in the actual over at the OMB or over at the executives, or Congress might be having that conversation, but it doesn't happen there. And that's when I saw industry sneak into the conversation. Was Jim.
I worked in Treasury for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And within Treasury, we had the authority to move small amounts of money within a line item from one program to another. The authority was not very broad, but at least we had that. And that allowed us to deal with a lot of these last minute things where, gosh, program A can't spend all of it, but program B is running short. They're both in the same line item. Let's move some money over. Is that not common in the rest of government?
So when I worked at Department of Defense, we couldn't move them between line items, but we could move the scope of specific contracts was written in such a way that if you had extra money spent on specific contracts, you could ask your contracting officer to include in additional scope under specific specified areas. So it was similar. We were adding line items to contracts, thus allowing us to take any additional money we had and move them over to those line items. So the Department of Defense did it slightly differently, but it sounds very similar to what you might have been doing over at Treasury. It was done by contracts. And then when I was at the Department of Justice, within an individual working group, you could move the money around between buckets. So money that was used for software could be used for hardware, for instance, as long as you were in the IT, we call them buckets. So they weren't specific line items necessarily, but the bucket of grouping that could go with that. But you couldn't go ahead and spend that over in office supplies because office supplies was a whole other working group that had its own line item of budget. So you couldn't move it around. So that is true. Some agencies have the ability to do that, but you were right about the limited funds. I mean, it was pennies compared to what the whole budget is. Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about this, use it or lose it. If you had, say, a $4 million project that was spread over 4 equal years, 1 million each year, Does the 4 million have to be in the first year's budget, or is there 1 million in each year budget? And do you have to commit that you've got things you're gonna spend that 1 million in the year, or can the money just kind of randomly flow in the future? So you'll have 4 million spent over the 4 years.
Right. So it all depends on how the contract is written, right? So there's different types of contracts that the government can write. Some of them have supplies written into them. Some of them do not. Some of them are what's called firm fixed price contracts. Some of them are called I almost said TNA, it's T&M, time and materials contracts. They go along with that. When those contracts are written, oftentimes contracts have an outlay the first year because they're acquiring equipment or requiring licensing. Something goes along with that. Sometimes that is already procured by the government. They're sitting around waiting for the contractor to come in and actually implement it. So it depends on how the contract itself is written. And that determines the burn rate that the contractors are all measuring themselves against. What I was really talking about is when they get to that out year of like the third out year, that's when they start being concerned about their gap in burn rate and what they've actually billed the government. And that's when they start having conversations with the COTAR, with the Corps, with the contracting officer of, hey, so according to my math, we're going to have $500,000 at the end of this 4 years that we didn't spend because XYZ. So let's talk about where can we move that around in our bucket or in our line item? Where can we move that around? Because contractors are getting a small percentage of against all this money they're billing. A small percentage of what they're billing goes to fund the contracting company. The percentage is bigger if they don't sit with the government workers. If they sit with the government workers, it's a smaller percentage, but either way, they're getting a percentage. So that's profit for them. That's what they need in order to have their business. Does that answer your question? It depends on how the contract is written. Yeah, so it could be it won't be all in the first year. It won't be all in the first year, but they could have an overlay in the first year and then spread it out over the 4 years. Or you could have, if it's only a labor contract and it's a firm fixed price, then it is spread out over those 4 years. Mm-hmm.
Help me understand, there's governmental employees
Mm-hmm.
and then there's contractors.
Mm-hmm.
Who hires the contractors? Who pays for the contractors? And why, if we have all these governmental employees, do we also need contractors?
Yeah, we talked. The contracting companies are what win the work for the government. So each agency puts out contracts for work that their federal employees cannot accomplish, either because they don't have the specific skills that are needed or because they don't have the specific staff that is needed. Contract companies are what win the contracts. It is those companies' responsibilities to find the contractors. So they hire them and the contractors are employees of those contract companies. Now, there are specific things that you have to meet. When you submit a contract, you always have what's called, it's not called required staff. It's called crucial, there's a word there for that. And it's the staff that you promise you're going to hire, right? And sometimes you've actually attached resumes to your bid, right? You said, because maybe you have a science contract and you're going to need 4 physicists, and you went out and got 3 of them from, you got somebody from Berkeley and somebody from MIT and somebody from the University of Michigan, and you've put their resumes in your contract. You have guaranteed that those 3 people, if you award me this contract, those 3 people will work on this project, right? The rest of them then are probably in a category where you're saying, these people will have these sorts of degrees, these people will be able to work these hours. Sometimes contracts, you have to be able to work hours that offset international work that's happening on military installations or at embassies. So, you all have this many staff that can work this. IT has to have 24-hour help desks going on, have to be able to do this, blah, blah, blah. So when a contract company is staffing, they have to be able to meet all of those regulations that they put in their winning bid. But other than that, they're responsible for going and getting the people. And they're responsible for handing in all the people's paperwork to get through the security clearance process of each individual agency. As we talked about last week, that the amount of contractors working for the government has gone up steadily over the last 50 years, whereas the federal employees have gone down. And we're about to hit a huge cliff with all those retirements of federal employees. And all that'll mean is more contractors because the work hasn't gone away. As I emphasized last week, you can have disagreements about where the work should go and how much you want to pay for it. But unless you're getting rid of the work, somebody has to do it. And so if you're not going to put a federal person on it, it's going to end up as a contract. And these are billions and billions and billions of dollars that we are talking about here with federal contracts. Billions.
Many of us in the country are in some way at the federal trough. Those of us in the room here, it's Medicare and Social Security. There's a lot of other programs going on in the United States for other folks. Is there any sort of planned obsolescence or are many programs at all designed to eventually run out, or are they everyone build in, cost of living and everything else?
Well, I mean, the entitlement programs, as we refer to them, right? Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are really the third rail, right? I think if there's one thing I learned from putting together these two presentations, it's that how disappointed I am as a voter and as a citizen that I don't hear enough people having these very hard conversations. We cannot, if I go back to that slide back here, we cannot have a conversation about the economy of the US without talking about that 64% of that pie. We have to be able to have intelligent, nonpartisan conversations about Medicare, about Social Security, about Medicaid, and how we're going to fund it. And if it turns out that at the end of those conversations, we've decided that's our number one priority, great. But who's having those hard conversations? And who's having the hard conversations about a budget process, which every single statistic shows us doesn't work? Who's talking about updating that Budget Act of 1974? Who's having that conversation? I mean, maybe Bernie Sanders, maybe Elizabeth Warren, but honestly, who else is having these conversations? These are really hard conversations, and I'm just super disappointed as a citizen and voter that I don't have better choices to vote for of people who are willing to take those on.
You mentioned, or in the videos that was mentioned, that whole process of going through the committees and all the appropriations committees in House and Senate. Is there and it has to pass in those. Is there a margin? Is it a simple majority?
Simple majority. Yeah, simple majority for passing through the committees themselves. And then simple majority actually for the appropriations bill themselves as it's being passed. Now there's this weird rule over in the Senate about I think it's called the Byrd rule that Congress enacted on itself about if you're voting for something that's going to raise the national, I can't remember if it was the deficit or the debt, if it's going to raise spending, it needs a certain number of votes versus ones that don't. And then the Senate, the Congress makes its own rules. This is what also is weird. They make these rules and then they feel like they're hedged in by them. But then when they want to make exceptions, they do. So they took away this clause in order to pass the Affordable Care Act. They also took away this clause when they were passing Trump's tax cuts. So there's a way for them to take these rules and put them wherever they want that would changes the number of votes that they need. Bottom line, simple majority for most of what's needed for the budget.
Yeah, I've got it. Can you go to that chart where it's the bar chart? You said the 4 years where they were on time.
Oh yeah, let's see if we
can. And then I have a question. First, see between, call it 2008 to call it 18, there's nothing there up to what, can you explain like what's going on there where there's no bar? What's going on? And then I have a question.
None of the appropriations bills were passed by October 1st. So if you remember, this is during the Obama years. Congress and Obama fought a lot, particularly over the budget, and they have both coming in, the laws that were passed right before Obama was sworn in, having to do with the, forget the name of it, but it was the Recession Recovery Act, the stuff that was happening there. That created a problem, and then the Affordable Care Act. So Congress and the White House were not seeing eye to eye. No appropriations bills were passed by October 1st.
I gotcha. So here's my question. My question is, so now with 34 trillion deficit, right? When did the train get off? Was there a compelling event when the train went off the rails and why we're staying off the rails?
So if I'm going to answer this as, I'm not an economist. So I'm going to answer this as based on a class I heard here at HASP a few weeks ago from an economist. A lot of it has to do with this interest rate debt that we're paying, right? Because compounding interest is compounding interest. It's always just going to grow until we figure out a way to pay down the actual debt itself. The interest on the debt is continuing to grow, and that piece of the pie will continue to push the rest of the pieces of the pie. And then there is the entitlement programs themselves, the actual growth with that. After that, I don't know, because just not an economist, I'm sorry.
Quite a few years ago, in a brief moment of lucidity, Congress authorized the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and they came within one vote. A politician, of course, but they came within one vote of actually producing a solution to the perpetual underfunding of Social Security and Medicare. Is there anything like that on the horizon?
Not that I can see. And I've kind of scoured that congress.gov site I recommended to you all. And by the way, I'm sending that all out with the evaluation. And of course, all the links from last week will be in that email. I kind of scoured through to see what the appropriations bills and the appropriations committees were looking at. And I couldn't find anything in the past 5 years of anybody proposing even any legislation about anything to do with Medicare or Social Security that had to do with any reforms or anything, the scope of what we're talking about here. Again, it's those hard conversations that we need measured people who are not just there to get their two, right? Congress serves 2 terms and they get lifetime healthcare and they get lifetime retirement. We need people who are not just there for their 2 terms, right? Who are there for something else. And it's unfortunately the will isn't there for some of those bigger reforms. Same with finance or campaign finance reform, not there.
Still on the topic of going off the rails with the deficit. You know probably, Amy, the national high school debate topic last year was fiscal distribution of wealth. And the first thing that we uncovered was there's about between $400 and $600 billion of taxes owed every year that are never collected. I mean, think how a few years of actually collecting the taxes that are owed would do to reducing the deficit. The other thing I wanted to mention was somebody, a representative in the South, wanted to sunset all those entitlements every year. So every year we'd have a discussion whether or not there would be Social Security the next year, and Medicare and Medicaid. And of course, the way Congress fights with itself now, you know, all that stuff would just get stopped and upended for long periods of time, and the country would be kind of a mess.
Yeah.
In that 60% that the Congress can't do anything about their entitlements, does that include federal retirement, military retirement? Isn't that in the mandatory 60%?
No, veterans health care is included in that. And the Veterans Administration, so the biggest buckets of federal spend, and since we were talking about the budget, I didn't include a lot about actual federal spending, but it's actually Medicare, Social Security, veterans healthcare. Those are the 3 top spenders in that category. The veterans is a line item in the Veterans Affairs Department, but the other 2 are with Health and Human Services. So if you ever go out and try to Google like spend by agency, you'll find that Health and Human Services is disproportionate to everybody else in the country. And it's specifically because of Medicare and Social Security. So when we talk about controlling it, that's another big one, controlling healthcare costs. If the 2 biggest line items of the biggest part of our pie relate specifically to healthcare, then controlling healthcare costs has to be part of the conversation.
So my question is more like, if you get 20 years in the Air Force, you could retire and get money. Where does that money come from?
Okay, so that pension comes out of the discretionary spending of the military.
Gotcha.
Right, so it's part of that. But the actual healthcare component that federal employees do get as part of their retirement package comes out of the mandatory spend. And that's because they can technically change our retirement at any time. It's all by law.
Is there any data about just how expensive shutdowns, threatened shutdowns, CRs are, just presumably wasting money?
Yeah, there is some data about shutdown themselves. I couldn't find any on actual continuing resolutions. I was trying to find something that showed kind of like impact. I couldn't find that. There is some money of the federal shutdown themselves. Specifically the shutdown under the Trump administration, and there was a long shutdown under the Obama administration. Those have been studied of how much impact that was against the federal government. Unfortunately, what a lot of that impact is lost productivity. Because remember, federal workers get their money back, contractors do not, but contractors can't work. Most of them can't work during that time. And productivity is a hard thing, as kind of a squishy thing for people to think about when they're talking about the impact of something happening. And they don't often think of just productivity, because you think, well, eventually we'll catch up to that. Well, yeah, but now we're 6 months behind and where we would have been. Yeah, it's kind of where you end up going with that. Thanks, David, by the way, for passing this mic around.
I'm not trying to resolve anything here, but earlier there was a comment about the rate that continues to grow with Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. Has there ever been any congressional talk about putting a cap on a growth year? In other words, if the cost of living had gone up 4%, but the cap only allowed for 3%, then the cap would kick in.
I don't know. Yeah, well, the COLAs are out there for that. I know that the two that I hear a lot from, so as I mentioned last time, a lot of federal employees are unionized, right? So my husband's still unionized. So I get a lot of union materials into the house. So I know the two that are talked about a lot are raising the retirement age, right? And one that's talked about for federal employees as well as for just general Social Security is raising the benefit, how the benefits are calculated based on earning years, right? Taking in more earning years into the calculation of that. For federal employees right now, your retirement is based on what's called your high threes. So the 3 years you were earning the highest amount of money. There's actually a quite significant amount of cost savings for the federal government if they go to the high fives. So they take an average of your high fives. So that's a big one that's debated about. But I haven't heard beyond it's tied to inflation. The COLA is tied to inflation. I haven't heard of any other cap conversation, but there may be, and I'm just unaware of that. Oh, so the COLA on the Social Security is limited? Okay, so there is currently, there's a lot of cap spending on Medicare that is being talked about. And in particular, there's a few laws that are, well, proposals of laws that are out there, particularly around implementation of caps on providers and hospitals paying in. There's actually last week, the state of Texas sued the federal government or complained to the federal, sent a letter to the federal government. I'm not sure what they were doing. Texas is doing its own thing. But it had to do with the fact that the Health and Human Services was changing the rate at which they were going to give states reimbursement for Medicare expenses. And it had to do with the fact that they had caught the states, in essence, reducing the amount, or inflating, I should say, the amount of money that they could claim from the federal government based on double billing from the hospitals. And so there was this issue, they recalculated, and it means that states are going to get less money from the Medicare program. And of course, the states are telling everybody that that means people are going to get less services and people are going to lose their Medicaid coverage and et cetera, et cetera. It's this huge thing that's going around. So there's a lot of conversation about that constantly with the caps on the Medicare and the Medicaid as well. Medicaid is a huge part from the states. Medicaid, sorry, I was saying Medicare and I meant Medicaid this whole time. My apologies. Thank you for catching that. Yeah, Medicaid, as I was talking about. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. This was really good. Thanks. I'm going to stop the share there.